It's a feeling that's flowing like a river. Time to swap them dollar signs for dreams. There's a river running through it and it flows through you and me.
Welcome to Water Planet News. I'm John Osborne, broadcasting from Spokane, Washington. Water Planet News has invited Patty Martin, the former mayor of Quincy, Washington, to talk to us about the 6 new major data centers that have located to Quincy, Washington. This is the subject of a recent New York Times article. In September of 2011, Patty and I toured Quincy, and then after the New York Times article, we sat down to do this interview. These data centers are important. They represent a major footprint on the Columbia River Dam and hydropower generation system. They also represent a large demand on the community's groundwater, as well as raising public health concerns because of the large number of these diesel engines located in the community. Here to tell this story is Patty Martin.
Hey, my name's Patty Martin. I'm the former mayor of a small agricultural community in Washington State called Quincy. So Quincy is located in the heart of the Columbia Basin and as an agricultural community is low to moderate income and a population that is 74% Hispanic. Because of our cheap water and cheap electricity, Quincy has become a target for the siting of data centers. Most people think of these as the cloud. These are huge facilities. Microsoft's, for example, takes up 500,000 square feet, 70 acres, and to store the electronic data that people use on a routine basis to run their iPhones and websites and to play games against each other. Right now we are at 6 data centers with large capacity diesel generators to provide backup power if we should ever have a power outage. And at this point in time, we are permitted for 158 locomotive-sized diesel generators, only 17 of which will have pollution control devices on these engines. Yeah, the concern is just the sheer number of these locomotive-sized generators within less than 2 square miles and the amount of diesel particulate matter. Diesel particulate is 7.5 times more toxic than all 188 of the regulated hazardous air pollutants. 7 times more toxic than the combined toxicity of all of those hazardous air pollutants. Additionally, the data centers use huge amounts of electricity. Between the 6 data centers in Quincy, I believe that the combined electrical power is enough to serve a community of over 400,000 people. So there's a huge heat dissipation issue with these data centers, and they require huge amounts of volume or huge amounts of water to cool them. So for example, each of the data centers withdraws from our aquifer about 500,000 gallons of water each day just to cool the towers. And so between the electrical demand, the water usage, and then the air pollution, the environmental impact of these facilities, especially on a small town like Quincy, is overwhelming.
When you've raised concerns with Microsoft and others, what's been the response?
Well, I'm not sure that we actually got to raise concerns with them. We asked a lot of questions when they were first, in the case of Microsoft and Yahoo, they were expanding. So they were adding to an existing facility. And when we started asking questions of the state wouldn't provide us with any information. What they instead required us to do was to raise our questions during the public comment period, and then they would provide answers to us. And so ultimately what we ended up doing was filing appeals on each one of the permits. There is an army of attorneys for each of the industries, and then there is the army of attorneys that represent the Department of Ecology, and we're up against both of those entities, and obviously outmatched. We got involved in this in August of 2010, and with the exception of probably 6 weeks out of that entire time, we have been under motions for summary judgment, or we have been filing appeals, or we have been under motions in limine. We've been preparing for hearing, multiple motions for summary judgment from a number of these attorneys. I mean, they've done everything they can to just keep us bombarded with legal work when we're not attorneys. So there's been a huge learning curve to come up to speed on the Clean Air Act and the state's Clean Air Act. In the case of Quincy, what it appears that the state did was in 2009, they gutted the state's clean air rules so that a certain standard called TBAC, or Best Available Control Technology for Toxic Air Pollutants, which is the state's more stringent air quality standards, they gutted those rules so that they applied a lesser standard as these facilities were coming into Quincy. And in lieu of applying this more stringent standard, instead what they did for Quincy was they established a goal of 100 cancers per million, that they would allow the cancer from diesel particulate matter, again, that very, very toxic air pollutant, they would allow it to rise as high as 100 cancers per million before they would require any mitigation or offsets. In 2007 or 2008, the legislature passed their first tax incentive. And at that time, I know that Microsoft saved about $100 million in taxes. Then the legislature was approached in 2010, again to extend the tax credits, but this time to only if data centers sited within an urban growth area, within a community. And this was presented by the Quincy Port District. And I suspect at that time, Quincy was probably one of the few areas that actually was willing to accept these huge facilities with all of these generators inside of their urban growth areas. So each one of these facilities received a tax credit to site there. And in exchange, all they had to do was create 35 jobs. There was no explicit requirement that they had to put on pollution control devices. So these companies saved hundreds of millions of dollars, and the cost for controls is probably less than $2 million on each of these facilities. And some of the wealthiest companies in the world are in Quincy without putting controls, again, pollution control devices like diesel particulate filters or diesel oxidation catalysts or ammonia scrubbers on their engines. The 2010 tax incentive had tied to it that each one of these facilities had to create at least 35 jobs. Okay, we're talking 35 jobs in exchange for hundreds of millions of dollars in tax incentives. That was the trade-off. We get the pollution, they get the $100 million tax incentives, we get 35 jobs. These generators, these engines have to be run monthly. And because there's so many of them, once they're all installed, there will either be 5 running every day of the week if they're run 7 days of the week, or there'll be 7 run every day of the week if they're run 5 days a week. But that's for perpetuity. That's until these facilities change over to some other backup power. But we had all been misled because the engines are also run when they take some of the computers offline. Just like you would de-energize, you would unplug your computer if you were servicing it. It's the same thing with Microsoft. They de-energize. They unplug themselves from the power grid and they run their backup generators if they're going to service certain parts of their facility. I think one thing that everybody can do is be as responsible. We talked about this before. Be as responsible with their electronic waste. I mean, if you are done with your emails and you don't need to keep them, get rid of them. There's according to the New York Times, there's over 3 million of these facilities worldwide, and they're only operating at like 10% capacity. If they don't, need more capacity, they aren't going to build more of these facilities. So delete the information you're not using so that there doesn't have to be, an increased construction of facilities like this. So we can all be responsible in that way. The Department of Ecology could enforce and have the laws properly implemented. Again, they changed rules that were in place. In fact, I would argue and have continued to argue that those same rules are currently in effect because they were adopted under our federal state implementation plan, federally enforceable can't be changed on the whim of the Department of Ecology. So I would want the Department of Ecology to properly implement the laws. As far as the legislature goes, insist that these tax dollars, that a portion of these tax dollars that were saved by these industries be used to put on controls.
Thanks, Patty. I just want to take this moment to honor your work and the work of others in your community. Standing up to protect your community is difficult, and especially when you're challenging large companies, some of the wealthiest in the world, as well as Washington state government, which has a repeated pattern, especially in eastern Washington, of supporting corporate and institutional interests over the public interest. For more about this story, you can read the New York Times article by James Glantz, The Cloud Factories, or visit the Sierra Club website for the Upper Columbia River Group and click on Quincy Data Centers. And that's today's program. Thank you for listening. And thank you for caring about water, about the land, and about the future of our communities.
It's a feeling that's flowing like a river. Time to swap them dollar signs for dreams. There's a river running through it and it flows